Hello, and thanks for joining us. We're here today with Paula Kensington, who has over 30 years' experience as a CFO and runs her own consulting group, PK Advisory, where she helps CFOs and CEOs grapple with the day-to-day complexities involved in balancing profitability and purpose. Today, we're going to talk about turning current business models on their head. Paula, in your first green paper, you talk about outmoded business models as hampering positive change. Tell us more about that.
Yeah, I think business models that we are currently using today have been in circulation for tens of years and decades of business experience, and I think they're no longer serving us because we can't bring everything into the business model. We can't bring all the costs of doing business into these business models. And what I mean by that is there's decisions made outside of these business models that just aren't getting reflected. So, if I'm a manufacturer, for example, take the cost of raw materials, that's going to be a big part of my business model cost. But nothing in that business model is taking into account the scarcity of those resources. Okay, they might take into an element of supply and demand where the price of those resources is going up, but there's no attribution around the fact that those resources are finite, the fact that the world's running out of certain resources. And so none of that cost of the planet and cost to other people and society at large, none of that cost is in the business model. And if you take food, for example, you take the cost of buying your food from the farmer, nothing is taken into account the decisions that farmers had to make by producing your crop and not producing a different crop, or how that farmer rotates the crop to think about the soil and the carbon that's stored in the soil, and all of those challenges where that's getting disrupted, or even the fact that he's growing your crop at all and it's not actually the forest that's sitting there and building into the ecosystem. And then you think about clothing, and you think about the cost of waste. Like, is that cost in our business model? I don't think so. I think a lot of, certainly fast fashion, is about bringing in low quality products and selling them cheap in a consumer driven demand market where there's not the life expectancy of that garment for more than 6 months or 12 months, and then it just ends up in the thousands and millions of tons of landfill. Like, none of that cost is in the business model.
Yes. So what business models do you see as more appropriately aligned with environmental preservation?
Yeah. And I think there's a few. I think definitely the circular closed loop business model, where we move from this linear thinking about taking, making and wasting, and we're bringing in that circular, like, what do we do from cradle to cradle, not cradle to grave, but from the whole way of creating that product all the way back to when that product becomes unusable. What do we do with the whole product? And I think that's a business model that really works to the planet's advantage. And then there's also collaborative ecosystem business models. There's a great resource at Project Breakthrough. If you Google Project Breakthrough business models, there's about 7 different business models and real examples on companies that are using these business models. So this collaborative one is where we're serving and trying to solve a global problem rather than a business problem. And in this example, it goes back to, I think, 9 years ago, where Levi Jeans really started to own the challenge around how much water is wasted in making denim. And so Levi's didn't go off and try and solve the problems themselves. They got 9 of their competitors together, and all 10 of them tried to solve the global problem about how do we stop using and wasting so much water in making denim. So they used this collaborative ecosystem approach where it wasn't their competition, but they said, well, together we can solve this global problem. And so that's a really beautiful way of being more aligned with nature. And so this idea of moving from a value chain to a value web that's come up in the studies that I've been doing at the moment, but also Deloitte's kind of came up and have also used this term. And they say that a value chain is the value based on the production of a goods or service, and the value web is the value of the knowledge that's built around producing that product or service. And so, that feels a lot more circular and supportive, and thinking about all the stakeholders, not just the shareholders.
Yes, so it's really taking a very holistic view rather than a straight linear view, I guess, and having more of an open-minded approach compared to old ways of doing business that just don't seem to serve us anymore. Yeah. And so, if you're a CFO and you really want to make some positive changes, but you're struggling, where do you start?
Yeah, so, I think the internet is a friend. If you don't have, big consultants that you can go to, and, budgets don't always allow that to happen for us, but there's lots of free resources out there. And I think, it starts with maybe even, a bit of navel gazing and asking ourselves questions about why are we producing the product or the service that we are? And, what is it that we do with that product or service that might have an impact on the environment or our social systems that we operate in? You talk then about the fact that we have this linear thinking, and how do we actually think more systems thinking approach? And it's something that I've spoken to in previous videos, but also in my green papers. It's something that I didn't learn at school or in my education around how to think about a whole system. Of course, we're operating in a whole system. We're not in isolation, but we don't think of it like that sometimes when we put our business hats on. So think about what is it that we're doing and why we're doing it and how we're doing it and where we're doing it, and starting to ask ourselves these questions will help to sort of uncover some of the impact that maybe we've just glossed over, or it's been an inconvenient truth. Maybe it's about time to get real. And some companies, have said, look, we haven't been the best, the most sustainable. We haven't done, and we're not proud of some of the practices that we have done, but they've owned it. They've said, look, that's what we've done, and that was in our past, and now we're doing things differently. You look at some of the big brands like Nike, they've said that. You think about some of the bigger brands like Unilever and what they've done in the past, and now how they're being a lot more wary of what they're doing, more intelligent decisions based on more stakeholders and nature stakeholders. So again, it's about owning what we've done in the past and making a difference now. I think, you've asked me before about, is it too late? And absolutely not too late. I think as long as we know that we're making a difference, and the first step in any journey is the realization of where we are and what we're doing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess if you're a CFO though, and you want to make these positive changes, and that you have to, and it's important, but you've mentioned before, a lot of CFOs are really kind of struggling to make sure that they're still, and they're worried as well about making sure that they're still being very profitable, and that they're ticking all the traditional boxes that they have to tick as well. How is it possible to still make lots of good profit, but implement positive planet changes?
Yeah. And it is a tension, of course. And I think the answer is that it has to be, we have to find a way that we can be profitable and sustainable at the same time. And there's lots of data points out there that says when companies align themselves to ESG and the SDGs, they have better results, and there's evidence that points to that. But of course, there's going to be a transition to that. It can't just be a flick of the switch and all of a sudden we're doing better from a sustainability practice. But it does come at a cost. But I think over time that investment into sustainability will pay huge dividends, because people and customers and employees and suppliers all want to gravitate towards companies that are doing the right thing from a planet perspective. So I think my answer is, potentially when you look at the business model for change, the cost of implementing change is far outweighed by the cost of not implementing change. If I'm $1 million revenue business, then, and it's going to cost me, I don't know, $100,000 to, do some work internally, redirect internal resources onto a sustainable project, then what's at risk if I don't do it is my $1 million, not the $100,000 it's going to cost me to do it. So we kind of need to just reframe potentially our own mindsets around what's the cost of not doing this. And I think depending on the complexity of our business, whether we're privately owned or whether we're publicly owned or have external shareholders, we have to bring, I think, all of our stakeholders on the journey with us. And I think if we sat down in front of our board or our shareholders and said, this is at risk and it's going to cost us $100,000 to actually create a roadmap to get us through this and to get us into the next stage, it has to be worthwhile.
And what about investors? What's the role of investors in supporting businesses to do this?
Yeah. Well, if you read the press, and I talk to this about the reality, the green reality gap between what the investment community says versus what the CFO and the business world says, that there is misalignment there, because the investment community say we've got, and I can't remember the number, but $1 trillion of money that we want to invest into green assets, but we can't find any to invest in. And then the business world says to me, I've got this great idea on a sustainable product or service, and yet I can't get it off the ground because there's no funding. So there's this real mismatch between the two parties. And I think the investment community are challenged themselves because they've got the tension between short-term returns versus long-term investment. So they've got the pension funds that want, sustainable, predictable cash flows so that they can pay mums and dads their pensions. Yet these longer-term sustainable projects, might have a payback period of 30 years or more. So how do they balance their books in terms of people wanting money today versus their own investments in 30 years' time? So I can't answer that one in our 5-minute conversation, but I think recognizing that there is this disparity between the two challenges, and I think the role that the investment community can play with our CFO is to be supporting and listening to how does that business realign what the outcomes might be. So I think from a CFO perspective, it's being as honest as you're able to be, and transparent with the investment community that says we're going to have to take a different path to be able to get those kind of returns. And then people say to me, well, what about my bank? If I've got $1 million facility with my bank with covenants that says I've got to make profits of X, Y, Z, otherwise I'm going to breach covenants, that's a real problem. So I think talking to the banks, because the banks, again, have got targets in their own funding that says you've got to fund sustainable businesses. So I think it's about having conversations with the bank to say we need to renegotiate potentially banking covenants because business models have changed. And I think maybe in the past there's been some obvious hesitancy and understandable hesitancy, but I think it's really about engaging with our institutions, with our finance companies, with our investors to say our business model is shifting. We're seeing a reduction over here because we're not doing these things, and we need to invest in innovation and disruption, because if we don't invest in that, we're going to get disrupted anyway, and then we're going to have nothing potentially.
Yeah, absolutely. Very interesting topic there. And as you said, we could probably talk much further about that one in particular. Thanks so much, Paula. Fascinating conversation today. If you would like to know more, hop onto Paula's website, pkadvisory.com.au. There's lots of resources there. Thank you.
Thanks, Deb.